The buckskin gelding picked its way down the narrow mountain trail with the sure-footed confidence of an animal that had made this journey 100 times before. Spring had finally broken winter's grip on the high country, and the aspens were just beginning to show their first pale green. Ethan Blackwood sat easy in the saddle, his dark eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced vigilance of a man who had survived 15 years alone in the wilderness. He was 39 years old, though the mountains had carved him into something that looked both younger and older at once. His face was weathered dark from endless days under the high-altitude sun, lined deep around the eyes, from squinting across vast distances and harder winters than most men could imagine. His beard, trimmed close against his jaw, showed threads of silver that hadn't been there even 2 years ago. Dark hair hung past his collar, tied back with a strip of leather to keep it from his face while he worked. The weight of his Hawken rifle rested familiar in its saddle scabbard. The big knife at his belt had been his constant companion since he'd come west at 24, running from a wound that had never quite healed. His buckskin trousers bore the stains and patches of hard use. His wool shirt, faded to the color of creek water over stone, had been washed and mended so many times the original color was anyone's guess. This was the uniform of a man who lived by his hands and his wits, who answered to no one but the mountains and the seasons. Below him the valley opened up gradually, revealing the scattered evidence of human habitation in this wild country. Smoke rose from a few distant cabins. The trail widened where wagon ruts had worn twin paths through the grass. This was the edge of civilization, such as it existed in Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1857, where the beaver market had collapsed and the wagon trains were finding new routes, and a man could still carve out an empire if he was tough enough and smart enough and willing to pay the price in solitude. Ethan had paid that price. 15 years he had lived alone in the high country, building his operation from nothing. Trap lines that stretched from the Tetons all the way to South Pass. Trading relationships with the Crow and Shoshone that were built on mutual respect and fair dealing. Money in the bank at Fort Bridger, more than most men in the territory could claim. A cabin he had built with his own hands, solid and weatherproof, positioned in a high meadow that gave him everything he needed to survive and thrive. But as he rode down from the mountains this April morning, Ethan carried with him a realization that had been growing all through the long winter. An empire was worthless if there was no one to pass it to. Money in the bank meant nothing if it died with him. The cabin would stand empty when he was gone, and all the work, all the years, all the careful building would dissolve like snow in spring runoff. He needed a partner. Not for romance or companionship or any of the soft reasons men usually sought wives. He needed someone practical, someone who could work beside him, who could run the operation when he was gone for weeks checking distant trap lines, who could preserve meat and maintain supplies and keep accurate accounts. Someone tough enough to survive the isolation and the winters and the endless hard work that was the price of this life. He had tried love once. Catherine Morrison, the minister's daughter back in Pennsylvania, with her refined manners and her pretty face and her dreams of a respectable life. She had looked at him and seen something worth saving, some rough potential that could be civilized and smoothed down and made presentable. 3 days before their wedding, she had run off with a cavalry lieutenant heading west, leaving him a note that he could still recite from memory 15 years later. "You are too hard, Ethan, too cold. All wilderness and no civilization. I need a life, not just survival." The note had frozen something in him that he had thought might never thaw. He had sold everything he owned, bought a horse and a rifle, and headed west with nothing but a bitter determination to prove that he could do more than just survive. He could thrive. He could build something that mattered, something that would last. And he had. But now, at 39, with his body still strong but showing the first signs of the wear that comes to all men who live hard, he understood what Catherine's note had failed to mention. A man could build an empire in the wilderness, but if he died alone, the wilderness would swallow it whole as if it had never existed. The Hartwell trading post came into view as Ethan rounded the last bend in the trail. He had been here before, of course. Duncan Hartwell had run a good operation back when the beaver market was strong fare in his dealings and sharp in his trading. But Duncan had been dead 3 winters now, frozen to death in a blizzard after a night of whiskey, and the widow Margaret had been trying to hold things together ever since. The place showed the strain. The roof sagged in places. The porch tilted where a support beam had rotted through. The whole operation had the look of something slowly surrendering to entropy. Ethan knew the situation. Everyone in the territory knew it. The widow had debts Duncan had left behind, and the beaver market had collapsed, and the wagon trains were taking newer routes. She had maybe 6 months, maybe a year, if winter was mild, before she would lose everything. Her only real asset, her only hope of salvaging anything from the wreckage, was marrying off one of her daughters to a man with means. She had 2 daughters, he had heard. One was supposed to be quite beautiful, the kind of beauty that could turn a man's head and make him forget practical considerations. The other was older, plain, useful around the place. The widow would naturally push. The pretty one would position her for maximum effect, would do everything in her considerable power to secure a good match. But Ethan Blackwood had not survived 15 years in the mountains by being easily distracted by surface appearances. He had learned to look past the obvious to what was real. A pretty pelt meant nothing if the animal had been sick or the fur damaged. A clear stream could hide treacherous currents beneath. A sunny day could turn to white-out blizzard in the space of an hour. He needed someone who would last, someone who would work, someone who understood that survival in this country required more than charm and a pretty face. He had made his decision before he ever rode into the clearing. Now he just needed to see if his instincts were right. The main room of the trading post smelled of old smoke and cured meat, and the musty scent of furs that had hung too long without selling. Margaret Hartwell appeared from the back room when Ethan pushed through the door, her face lighting with a hope so desperate it was almost painful to see. She was perhaps 50, worn thin by hard work, and harder times her gray dress as faded as the stock on her shelves. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the forced brightness of someone trying to pretend everything was fine when it clearly was not. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you down from the high country?" Ethan removed his hat, holding it in his hands with the kind of respect his mother had beaten into him as a child, back when she was still alive, and he was still young enough to believe the world was a fundamentally fair place. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the rough edges of a man who spent more time talking to horses and mountains than people. "I was hoping we might talk, about a matter of some importance." The hope in her eyes sharpened into something more focused, more calculating. She gestured to the rough plank table near the fireplace. "Of course, please sit. Can I offer you coffee? We have some stew left from dinner." Coffee would be appreciated. As she busied herself with the pot, Ethan took the opportunity to study the room more carefully. The inventory was depleted gaps on the shelves where goods should have been. The account books lay open on a smaller table covered with numbers that told their own story of decline even from this distance. A few furs hung on the far wall, but they were last season's catch, unsold, probably unsellable at this point. Through the window he could see movement in the yard. 2 figures, both female, one moving with studied grace toward the main building, the other carrying an armload of split wood toward the storage shed. Margaret returned with 2 tin cups, the coffee strong and bitter in the way of frontier hospitality. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup for warmth despite the mild spring air. "I understand," Ethan said without preamble, "that you have daughters of marrying age." Her breath caught just slightly, but he heard it. This was the conversation she had been hoping for, praying for, probably planning for in the dark hours of sleepless nights when she counted her dwindling assets and rising debts. "I do," she said carefully. "2 daughters. Rose is 22, accomplished in all the feminine arts. She sews beautifully, plays the fiddle, keeps a fine household. And Grace, my eldest, 26, who manages most of the practical affairs around the post." Ethan nodded slowly, filing the information away. Before he could respond, the door opened, and the figure he had seen through the window stepped inside. She was, he had to admit, genuinely beautiful. Blonde hair the color of wheat in September, arranged in careful waves that must have taken considerable time to achieve. Eyes the blue of a high country lake in summer. a figure that even her simple calico dress could not entirely hide. She moved into the room with the kind of practiced grace that spoke of careful cultivation of hours spent learning to hold herself just so to tilt her head at the perfect angle to catch the light. This was Rose, the investment, the hope, the daughter who was supposed to save them all. "Oh!" she said, her voice carrying just the right mixture of surprise and pleasure. "Mother, you didn't mention we had a guest." "Rose, this is Mr. Ethan Blackwood. Mr. Blackwood, my daughter Rose." The girl executed a small curtsy that would not have been out of place in a St. Louis parlor. Her smile was warm and inviting, her eyes assessing him with the kind of calculation that a successful trader would recognize immediately. She was measuring his worth, categorizing his assets, determining his value as a potential husband with the same cold precision her father would have used to evaluate a pelt. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, "we've heard so much about your success in the high country. It must be terribly exciting living so wild and free." Margaret gestured for Rose to join them at the table, and the girl settled herself in the chair positioned to catch the best light from the window. It was all very carefully orchestrated, very deliberately staged. Ethan recognized it for what it was, because he had spent 15 years watching animals try to attract mates, and humans were not so different when you stripped away the veneer of civilization. "It's living," he said, his tone neutral. "Not much exciting about checking trap lines in January when it's 20 below and the wind cuts through you like a knife." Rose laughed as if he had said something clever. "Oh, but surely there must be adventures, encounters with wild animals or Indians or dangerous weather." "Indians are mostly just people trying to get by, same as anyone. Animals are dangerous if you're stupid around them, but mostly they want to be left alone. Weather is weather. You respect it, or it kills you." He saw the flicker of confusion in her eyes as his responses failed to match her expectations. This was not how this conversation was supposed to go. He was supposed to be charmed, flattered, gradually drawn in by her practiced performance. Margaret jumped in, trying to smooth over the awkwardness. "Rose is quite accomplished, Mr. Blackwood. She sews beautifully, as I mentioned. She can make a dress from scraps that would rival anything you'd see in Denver, and she plays the fiddle like an angel." "I'm sure she does," Ethan said, and meant it. The girl clearly had skills, clearly had value in the kind of life her mother envisioned for her. But those were not the skills Ethan needed. A man could not eat fiddle music when the meat was running low. A pretty dress would not keep the cabin warm when the blizzards came howling down from the high passes. His attention drifted to the window, and that was when he saw her. The other daughter, Grace. She emerged from behind the storage shed carrying an armload of split wood that would have been substantial even for a man. Her dress was the color of old smoke, faded and patched in multiple places, made for work rather than display. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid that was half coming loose, strands escaping around her face. As she walked, he noticed the hitch in her gait, a slight drag of her right foot that spoke of an old injury, something permanent. She didn't glance toward the main building, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She was focused on her task, moving with the kind of purposeful efficiency that came from years of hard work, from understanding that in this life the work was never truly done, and complaining about it changed nothing. Ethan watched as she stacked the wood with careful precision, testing each piece to ensure it would burn cleanly, arranging the pile for easy access. Small things, details that most people would never notice, but they spoke volumes to a man who had spent 15 years surviving on his own. This was someone who thought ahead, who planned, who understood that the small efficiencies added up over the course of a long winter to make the difference between comfortable survival and desperate struggle. "Who is that?" he asked, interrupting whatever Rose had been saying about her needlework. Margaret followed his gaze, surprise evident on her face. "Oh, that's Grace, my eldest daughter. She manages most of the practical affairs around the post, as I mentioned." "Grace," Ethan repeated, tasting the name. He watched her finish with the wood pile and turn back toward the storage shed, that permanent hitch in her gait, neither slowing her down nor appearing to cause her any evident distress. She had adapted to it, incorporated it into her movement, found a way to work despite the limitation. Tough, practical, uncomplaining. The words formed in his mind unbidden, but they felt right. He set down his coffee cup and looked directly at Margaret Hartwell. It was time to be clear about why he had come. "Ma'am," he said, "I appreciate the hospitality, and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. But I should be direct about my purpose." Margaret sat straighter, and beside her, Rose leaned forward slightly, her practiced smile never wavering. "I need a wife," Ethan continued, "not for romance or companionship. I need someone practical, someone who can work hard, who won't complain about rough living, who won't expect things I can't give. I've been asking around, and folks said you had daughters of marrying age." "We do indeed," Margaret said, her hand moving as if to gesture toward Rose. Ethan cut her off before she could complete the motion. "With all due respect to your household, ma'am, I'd like permission to court Grace." The silence that followed was so absolute that Ethan could hear the wind moving through the pine trees outside, could hear the distant call of a crow, could hear his own heartbeat steady in his chest. He kept his eyes on Margaret, his expression calm and certain, giving her time to process what he had just said. Margaret's face went blank with shock. Beside her, Rose's practiced smile froze, then cracked, then shattered into something ugly and raw before she managed to school her features back into something resembling composure. Her face flushed red, then white, as the implication sank in. This was not supposed to happen. This was not the plan. Outside, perhaps 20 feet from the window, Grace had frozen mid-step. She stood there, wood chips still clinging to her dress, strands of hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, one hand unconsciously rubbing her bad leg as if it ached from the work. Her gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the mountains, had gone wide with something that looked less like joy or excitement and more like pure confusion. Ethan stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the spring sunlight. Grace remained where she was, watching him approach with the wary stillness of an animal that has been trapped before and learned caution. He stopped a respectful distance away, near enough to speak without shouting, far enough to give her space to breathe. Up close, he could see the birthmark on her left cheek, roughly the size and shape of a thumbprint, dark against her pale skin. Could see the work-roughened state of her hands, the dirt under her nails, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that had probably been fuller once before hard times and harder work had worn her lean. She was not beautiful in the way Rose was beautiful. There was no artful arrangement, no practiced grace, no cultivated charm. But there was something in the way she held herself, in the directness of her gaze as she looked at him, that struck him as more real than anything he had seen in that carefully staged scene inside the trading post. "Grace," he said, and watched her flinch slightly at her name spoken in his rough voice, "I'd like permission to court you if you're agreeable." She stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke, and her voice came out harder than she probably intended, sharp, with years of being overlooked, of being second choice, of being useful, but not wanted. "Why?" It was a fair question. It deserved an honest answer. "Because you're practical," he said. "Because you work hard, and you don't quit. Because you stack wood like someone who thinks ahead about winter even in spring. Because you don't expect things that can't be had." He paused, searching for the right words, and settled on the simplest truth he could offer. "Because you're real. Not playing a part. Just real." Grace continued to stare at him, and he could see her mind working behind those gray eyes, turning over his words, examining them for hidden traps or false promises. Around them the world seemed to hold its breath. A breeze moved through the cottonwood trees. Somewhere in the distance the crow called again. "I'm not pretty," she said finally, her voice flat and factual. "I limp. I've got this mark on my face. I'm 26 years old and nobody's wanted me yet. If you're looking for something I can't give you, you should say so now." "I'm not looking for pretty," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm looking for someone who won't break when the snow is 10 feet deep and the meat is running low. Someone who knows the difference between surviving and just existing. Someone who can work beside me, who can run things when I'm gone for weeks, checking distant trap lines. I need a partner, Grace, someone tough enough to build something that lasts." He held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his face. "Is that you?" She lifted her chin slightly, and something shifted in her expression. Not hope exactly, but something like recognition, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time, and what she saw matched what he was saying. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger now. "That's me." Ethan turned back toward the trading post where Margaret stood in the doorway, her face still showing shock and confusion, and Rose stood beside her rigid with barely controlled fury. "Ma'am," he called across the yard, "do I have your permission?" Margaret looked like someone had struck her with a board. This was not how it was supposed to work. Rose was the prize, the investment, the daughter who would save them all. Grace was just useful, just practical, just someone to keep things running until Rose made her advantageous match. But Margaret was also a practical woman who understood the brutal mathematics of their situation. Ethan Blackwood was established, successful, exactly the kind of man who could provide security in this hard country. He had money. He had property. He had a reputation for honesty and hard work. And for reasons she could not begin to fathom, he wanted Grace. Refusing him would be foolish. Arguing with him would be pointless. The choice, inexplicable as it might be, was clear. "I do," she said, her voice barely carrying across the yard. "I give my permission, if Grace is willing." Ethan looked back at Grace, his expression patient and serious, giving her the time and space to make her own choice, without pressure, without manipulation, without any of the games that had been played with Catherine Morrison 15 years ago in Pennsylvania. Grace's hands were shaking slightly. She clasped them together to steady them, and Ethan noticed but did not comment. This was a woman who had learned early to hide weakness, to soldier through pain and exhaustion and disappointment without complaint. But right now, standing in the spring sunlight with wood chips in her hair and dirt on her dress, she was allowing herself to show uncertainty, to admit that this moment was too big to face with perfect composure. "Yes," she said again, loud enough for her mother to hear. "I'm willing." Something shifted in Ethan's chest, a warmth he had not felt in 15 years, since before Catherine's note had frozen him solid. This was not love, could not be love this quickly, but it was something. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction at having made a sound tactical decision, or maybe just the simple pleasure of having a plan begin to come together. "Good," he said. "I need to check my lines, but I'll be back in 3 days. We can talk more then." He mounted his buckskin in one smooth motion, gave Grace one more long look that she returned with that same direct gray gaze, and then wheeled the horse and rode out of the clearing. Behind him, 3 women stood in various states of shock and fury and confusion, the afternoon sunlight slanting long across the mountain valley, the future suddenly uncertain in ways none of them had anticipated that morning. Ethan rode north back toward the high country and allowed himself the smallest smile. He had made his choice. Now came the work of seeing if it would hold. 3 days later, exactly when he said he would return, Ethan Blackwood rode back into the clearing at the Hartwell trading post. But this time he did not stop at the main building. Instead, he guided his horse around to the back, where he could see Grace working in the small herb garden she had carved out of the rocky soil. She heard the horse and looked up, her hand stilling on the weeds she had been pulling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan dismounted with his usual economical grace and stood there, hat in his hands, looking at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Need to talk," he said by way of greeting. "Somewhere private." Grace stood brushing dirt from her hands and nodded. She led him down to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, out of sight and earshot of the main buildings. The water ran high and fast with snowmelt, dangerous if you were careless, beautiful if you respected it for what it was. They stood on the bank, and for a long moment neither spoke. A small gray bird, a dipper, worked the rocks near the far bank, dunking beneath the surface and popping back up with mechanical regularity, going about its business with complete disregard for the 2 humans nearby. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I don't deal in pretty words or false promises." He said, his voice rough but steady. So I'm going to lay this out plain and you can decide if it's something you can live with." "Please do." Grace set her eyes on the rushing water rather than on him. "I live rough. The cabin is one room, maybe 14 feet by 16, no neighbors for 20 miles in any direction. Winters are hard up there, harder than down here in the valley. Summers are short. The work is endless, and most of it is heavy. I'm gone sometimes for weeks at a time running the distant trap lines, checking the sets, trading with the Shoshone and Crow. It's lonely, and it's dangerous. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, storms that come up out of nowhere and can kill you if you're not prepared. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and you're dead." He paused, making sure she was hearing him, really hearing him, and not just the romanticized version of frontier life that existed in people's imaginations. "I understand," Grace said quietly. "I don't think you do," Ethan said, and his voice was harder now, more urgent. "I'm not offering you comfort. I'm not offering you safety. I'm barely offering you survival. The cabin is solid. I built it myself, but it's still just one room with one bed and one stove and supplies that have to last 6 months at a stretch. There's no society up there, no other women to visit, with no church socials or quilting bees or any of the things women are supposed to want. There's just work and mountains and silence." Grace finally turned to look at him, and her gray eyes were steady and clear. "What are you offering?" Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "Partnership, respect, honesty. A share in what I've built, real ownership, not just being a wife in name. Protection the best I can give it, though I can't promise you'll always be safe because nothing is safe out here." He took a breath, and what came next was clearly harder for him to say. "But I can't offer you love. Won't lie and say I can. I gave that once to a woman back in Pennsylvania, and it near about killed me when she threw it back in my face. Something froze in me that winter, and I don't know if it'll ever thaw, so I can promise you loyalty, fidelity, partnership, a decent life if you're willing to work for it. But I can't promise you tender feelings or sweet words or whatever it is women dream about when they're young." The water rushed past, cold and clear and indifferent to human concerns. Grace was quiet for so long that Ethan began to think she might just walk away, might decide that honesty was too harsh a foundation for marriage, that she deserved better than a man who could not promise to love her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but firm, each word chosen with care. "I've been invisible my whole life, Mr. Blackwood. My mother loves Rose more, though she'd never say it out loud. Every man who's ever come through the trading post has looked past me to get to my sister. I've made my peace with being second choice, third choice, no choice at all. I learned a long time ago that when the sun decides who to shine on, shadow is where you learn to make your home. And I've made a good home there in that shadow, useful, capable, unseen." She turned to face him fully now, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized because he carried the same thing in his own soul. "So you being honest about not loving me, that doesn't hurt, Mr. Blackwood. I've lived 26 years without being loved for anything except my usefulness. What would hurt is you pretending something you don't feel, building a life on lies that would eventually crumble. Real is enough. Real is more than I expected." Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest. This woman was tougher than he had given her credit for. She had been tested by life in ways that left scars, but she had not broken, had not grown bitter, had simply adapted, had found a way to survive with her dignity intact. "You're stronger than you look," he said. "Have to be," Grace replied. "Weak things don't last long in this country." "No," he agreed. "They don't." He shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable in a way he rarely felt. This next part was harder, more vulnerable, but fairness demanded it. "You should know," he said slowly. "The woman I mentioned, from Pennsylvania. Her name was Catherine Morrison, minister's daughter. I was 22, working in the coal mines, trying to save enough to buy a piece of land and make something of myself. She was pretty and educated, and I thought she saw something in me worth saving." He stared at the rushing water, seeing not the creek, but a church in Pennsylvania, a young woman in a white dress, himself in his one good suit that still smelled of the camphor they had packed it in. We courted for a year. Her father approved because I was steady, showed up to church, didn't drink much. We planned a life. Nothing fancy, just a small farm, maybe some children eventually, a decent, respectable existence. 3 days before the wedding, she left town with a cavalry lieutenant heading west. Left me a note saying I was too hard, too cold, that I was all wilderness and no civilization, that she needed a life and not just survival. Grace listened without interrupting, and Ethan was grateful for that. These were not words he had spoken aloud to anyone, not in 15 years. That note, he continued, it froze something in me. Killed something, maybe. I sold everything I had and came west with nothing but a horse and a rifle and a determination to prove I could do more than just survive. Built my operation from nothing. Made money. Made a name. Proved she was wrong about at least some of it. He finally looked at Grace again. But she was right about the rest. I am hard. I am cold. I am wilderness with no civilization to soften the edges. That's not going to change. If you're hoping to fix me or gentle me or turn me into something else, you should know now it won't work. This is what I am. Grace considered this for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. I'm not looking to fix you, Mr. Blackwood. I learned a long time ago that people are what they are. All we can do is decide if what they are is something we can live with. And can you live with what I am? Can you live with what I am? A plain woman with a limp and a birthmark who'll never be beautiful, who's too old to have a lot of children, who knows how to work, but not how to charm. I already told you, Ethan said. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Then yes, Grace said. I can live with what you are. If you can keep being honest with me, if you can treat me like a partner and not property, if you can respect me even when you don't love me, I can do that? Then I'm still willing. Ethan nodded slowly, feeling the weight of this commitment settling over him like a familiar coat. This was happening. This was real. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small piece of paper folded carefully, the edges worn from being carried against his chest for 3 days. He held it out to her. Read that when you're alone, he said. I'm better at writing things down than saying them out loud. Then, before she could respond, he turned and walked back to where his horse waited, mounted up and rode out of the clearing without looking back. Grace stood by the rushing creek, holding the folded paper in her dirt-stained hands, her heart beating faster than it had any right to. She waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely before she unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was rough, the letters formed with obvious effort by a man more accustomed to tallying pelts than writing personal correspondence. But the words were clear. Your absence bothers me more than your presence should. I don't understand it, but it's true. E.B. Grace read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully, pressed it against her heart, and walked back to the trading post, with something that felt dangerously close to hope blooming in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. The courting period that followed was unlike anything Grace had ever imagined, though in fairness she had stopped imagining courtship years ago. Ethan came by every few days, always with a purpose, never just to visit for the sake of visiting. He would bring meat from a successful hunt, or check if they needed supplies from Fort Bridger, or help repair something that required strength and skill Margaret could not provide. He was not romantic, but he was reliable as sunrise. They fell into a pattern of working side by side, talking while their hands were busy with practical tasks. He would split wood while she hung laundry. She would pack supplies while he checked the fittings on his saddle. Conversation came easier when there was work to occupy the awkward spaces. He told her about life in the high country, about the rhythms of the seasons that governed everything, about the isolation that could drive some men mad, but had made him sane. She told him about managing the trading post, about the tricks of preserving food through winter, about the medicinal uses of plants that grew wild in the mountains and valleys. One afternoon she showed him a patch of yarrow she had been cultivating behind the storage shed. He crouched down to examine it, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he touched the leaves. "You know a lot about plants," he observed. "Where'd you learn it?" "Books, mostly. My father had some old medical texts, and I puzzled out the Latin names well enough. And Morningstar, she works for my mother sometimes. She's half Shoshone. She knows more about healing plants than any white doctor I've ever met." "You read Latin?" He sounded genuinely surprised. "Some. Enough to work out the meanings. Father taught both of us, me and Rose. She hated it. I didn't mind." "What else do you like?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody had asked her that in years. What did she like? She had to think about it. "Growing things," she said slowly. "Watching them come up from nothing. Solving problems, figuring out how to make things work better. Making order out of chaos. What about you?" Ethan thought about it for a moment, his expression serious. "Silence," he said finally. "Mountains. Watching weather roll in across the peaks, seeing the patterns, knowing what's coming. A good horse that knows its business, coffee strong enough to fight back." Grace laughed, quick and surprised, and the sound felt strange in her throat. She so rarely laughed these days, had almost forgotten how. Ethan looked at her when she laughed, really looked at her, and something in his weathered face softened just slightly. "You should do that more," he said quietly. "Laugh. It suits you." The words settled around Grace like a warm shawl on a cold evening. Nobody had ever told her that anything suited her before. The gifts started appearing without explanation or fanfare. A doeskin pouch with her initials burned into the leather, soft and beautifully made. A small knife with a wickedly sharp edge, perfect for the detailed work of harvesting herbs. A length of red ribbon, the first truly pretty thing anyone had given her in years. Ethan never mentioned these gifts, never made a show of giving them. They would simply appear where she would find them, small acknowledgments that he was thinking of her even when he was away in the mountains. Grace responded in kind, leaving things in his camp when she knew he would return there before coming to the trading post. Fresh bread still warm from the oven, socks she had knit in the evenings. His torn shirt mended so carefully that you could barely see where the fabric had been damaged. They were building something slowly and deliberately, like birds building a nest one twig at a time. Not love, perhaps, or at least nothing that either of them would have called love. But something real, something solid, something that felt like it might last. Rose watched it all with mounting fury that she barely managed to contain. She started making comments, small poisonous observations delivered with a sweet smile that did not reach her eyes. "I suppose Grace is just his type. Sturdy, practical, like a good plow horse." Or, "I hear mountain men don't expect much. Lucky for some people." Grace absorbed these barbs in silence, finding it easier to ignore them than to engage. But she noticed that Ethan's face grew progressively harder each time Rose opened her mouth, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested he was choosing his silence very deliberately. The breaking point came one evening after supper. Ethan had stayed late to help Margaret sort through Duncan's old account books, trying to make sense of the debts and assets. Rose sat by the fire, ostensibly working on some needlework, but her attention was focused entirely on Ethan. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying that familiar sweetness that Grace had learned to recognize as danger. "What is it exactly that draws a man to someone so very practical? I've always wondered. Surely you must want something more in life? Something beautiful to come home to, rather than just useful." The room went very quiet. Grace's hands stilled on the beans she had been shelling for tomorrow's meal. Margaret looked horrified, recognizing too late where this was heading. But Ethan's face remained perfectly calm, almost gentle, which somehow made his response hit even harder. "Beauty," he said slowly, deliberately, "is like a fancy knife. Looks real good hanging on the wall where people can admire it. But when you actually need to cut something, when the work has to be done, you want a blade that works. Something with a good edge, proper balance weight, you can feel in your hand. Something you can depend on when it matters." He returned his attention to the account books, dismissing Rose as if she had become irrelevant mid-conversation. "I'll take dependable over decorative every single time." Rose's face went white, then flushed deep red. She stood abruptly, mumbled something about a headache, and fled to the room she shared with Grace. Margaret followed quickly, leaving Grace and Ethan alone in the fire-lit room for the first time. The silence stretched out comfortable, rather than awkward. Outside, a coyote called from somewhere in the darkness. The fire popped and settled, sending up a small shower of sparks. "You didn't have to do that," Grace said quietly. "Wasn't defending you," Ethan replied, not looking up from the numbers he was reviewing. "Was stating a fact." He closed the account book with deliberate care and looked at her directly. "Your mother is deep in debt. Duncan left behind obligations he never mentioned to her. The post won't last another winter without a miracle or an infusion of cash she doesn't have." "I know," Grace said. "She was counting on Rose to marry well, to save them all." "I know that too. And now she's wondering if letting you marry me instead was a mistake. If she should have refused my suit and held out for someone who would take Rose off her hands." Grace met his eyes across the rough table. "Did she make a mistake?" "Won't know until we try," Ethan said. "But I know what I need, and I know what I saw in you from the start. Whether that's enough to build a life on, that's what we're going to find out." He stood moving closer, and they were suddenly more alone than they had ever been. Properly alone with no one watching, no performance required. The fire cast dancing shadows on the log walls. The spring night pressed against the windows. "Grace," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her breath catch slightly. "I need you to understand something." "What?" "This thing between us. Whatever it is, it's not going to be poetry and flowers and sweet words whispered in the dark. That's not who I am. But it will be real. I swear that to you. No lies, no false promises, no pretty words that don't mean anything. Just real." Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion she could not quite name. "That's enough," she whispered. "Real is enough. Real is more than enough." Ethan reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. His rough hand took hers, his palm calloused from years of hard work, warm and strong and careful. He held her hand like it was something valuable, something worth protecting. They stood there in the firelight, neither speaking, just holding hands, and it felt like a promise neither of them knew quite how to name. Not love, not yet, but something that might grow into love if they tended it carefully, if they gave it time and honesty and room to breathe. 2 weeks later, on a bright morning in June, when the wildflowers were beginning to bloom in the mountain meadows, a traveling preacher came through the valley. His name was Reverend Stone, a circuit rider who moved from settlement to settlement, bringing religion to people who had neither the time nor the resources for churches and full-time ministers. Ethan heard about it at Fort Bridger, where he had gone to trade some early-season pelts. He immediately saddled his horse and rode hard for the Hartwell trading post, arriving in the early afternoon with his horse lathered from the pace. He found Grace in her herb garden on her knees in the dirt, carefully transplanting seedlings from a cold frame to the main bed. She looked up at the sound of hoofbeats, shading her eyes against the sun. Ethan dismounted and walked over to her hat in his hands, his face serious. "Preacher's in the valley," he said without preamble. "Man named Stone. He'll be moving on tomorrow morning, heading up toward the mining camps. We could marry today if you're willing." Grace's breath caught. She sat back on her heels, her dirty hands forgotten, staring up at him. "Today? Tomorrow he'll be gone. Won't be another preacher through here for months, maybe longer. Could be fall before we get another chance." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face. "But if you need more time, if you're not ready, I can wait. This is your choice, Grace. Right up until the words are said, you can change your mind. I won't hold it against you." Grace looked at him, this hard man who was offering her a harder life, who could not promise love, but swore to honesty, who had chosen her over beauty, who stood now giving her one final chance to refuse. "I won't change my mind," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "How do you know?" She rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her dress in a futile gesture. "Because for the first time in my life, someone is offering me something real, something honest. Something that doesn't require me to be anything other than what I am. I'm not fool enough to walk away from that." Something flickered in Ethan's face, some emotion too quick and complex to name. "1 hour," he said. "I'll tell the preacher. Get yourself ready however you want to be ready." He turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at her. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saying yes, for taking the chance." Then he was gone, striding back to his horse with that economical grace she had come to recognize, leaving Grace standing in her herb garden with dirt under her nails and tears pricking her eyes and a future opening up before her like the vast Wyoming sky. The ceremony happened less than 2 hours later under the big cottonwood tree with perhaps 10 people gathered to witness. Reverend Stone was a lean man, weathered as old leather, with a Bible held together by faith and rawhide laces. He performed weddings and baptisms and funerals all across the territory, and he had long since learned to keep the ceremonies brief because frontier people had work waiting. Margaret stood at the front, her face tight and pale, looking like someone who had made a gamble and was not yet sure if she had won or lost. Rose stood apart, dressed in black, as if attending a funeral rather than a wedding, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. A few trappers who had heard the news and came down out of curiosity stood in back, and Morning Star appeared from nowhere, standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, bearing witness to something she seemed to understand better than the white folks present. Grace wore her best dress, which was not saying much, gray cotton, clean and pressed, with her mother's old shawl around her shoulders because the ceremony required something traditional. Her hair was braided and pinned up neat. That was the extent of her wedding preparation, and it felt right, somehow felt honest. Ethan wore buckskins and a shirt that looked newer than his usual work clothes, his beard freshly trimmed, his hat in his hands. This was his version of dressed up, and it was enough. Reverend Stone spoke the ancient words quickly used to frontier ceremonies where time was precious and sentiment a luxury few could afford. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony, which is an honorable estate instituted by God." The familiar liturgy rolled over them like water over stones. Grace heard the words but did not really listen. She was too aware of Ethan standing beside her, solid and real, his presence changing the air around her. "Do you, Ethan Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part?" "I do." His voice was steady, carrying no hesitation, no doubt. He meant it with every fiber of his being. "And do you, Grace Hartwell, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do you part?" Grace looked at Ethan, then really looked at him. His dark eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that felt more valuable than love. She saw choice, decision, certainty. He had chosen her knowing full well what he was getting. No illusions, no fantasies, just her exactly as she was. "I do," she said, and meant it with everything she had. "By the power vested in me by God in the territory of Wyoming, I now pronounce you man and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Reverend Stone looked at Ethan. "You may kiss your bride." Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then he leaned down his hand, coming up to cup her jaw with surprising gentleness, and kissed her. It was brief, almost formal, but his lips were warm and his hand on her face was careful, like she was something that mattered, something worth protecting. When he pulled back, something in his eyes had shifted, had opened slightly, and Grace felt the world tilt and resettle into a new configuration. They signed the record book, Ethan's signature bold and clear, Grace's smaller but equally steady. The trappers passed around a bottle of whiskey and offered rough congratulations. Margaret hugged Grace briefly and whispered, "Be good to him," which was as close to a blessing as Grace was going to receive. Rose had already disappeared, unable even to stay for the signing of the certificate. And then it was done. Grace Hartwell had become Grace Blackwood, wife to a mountain man bound to a life she could barely imagine, and a man she barely knew. The enormity of it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt oddly calm, like she had been holding her breath for 26 years and could finally exhale. Ethan brought the packhorse around already loaded with her few belongings. Her trunk with her dresses, her books, her herbs. Not much to show for 26 years of life, but it was hers, and that was enough. He helped her mount the sturdy paint mare he had brought for her, his hands steadying her when her bad leg made the mounting awkward. He did not comment on the weakness, did not draw attention to it, just helped matter-of-factly, and then swung onto his buckskin gelding with practiced ease. They rode north, leaving the trading post and everything Grace had ever known behind her. Her mother stood on the porch watching them go. Morning Star raised one hand in silent farewell. The post itself, sagging and tired already, seemed to be fading into memory, becoming something that belonged to her past rather than her future. Grace did not look back. Whatever lay ahead in those mountains, whatever challenges waited in the high country, whatever this marriage would become, she was riding toward it with her eyes open and her spine straight. She had made her choice. Now came the work of seeing it through. The trail climbed steadily as they rode north, following creek beds and game paths that only someone who knew this country intimately could navigate. The valley fell away behind them, the trading post shrinking to insignificance, then disappearing entirely as the pine forest thickened around them. The air grew cooler with each mile of elevation, gained cleaner, somehow sharp with the scent of pine resin and the last patches of melting snow that lingered in the deep shadows. Grace followed behind Ethan's buckskin, her paint mare proving sure-footed and steady despite the unfamiliar rider. They did not talk much. There was nothing that needed saying, and Grace was grateful for the silence, grateful for the time to let the magnitude of what she had just done settle over her like dust after a windstorm. She was married. She was Grace Blackwood, now wife to a man she barely knew, heading into country she had never seen, to a life she could only imagine in the vaguest terms. Every rational part of her mind insisted this was madness, that she should have asked for more time, that she should have demanded more information before binding herself to this hard man and his harder life. But the irrational part, the part that had said yes in her herb garden and yes again under the cottonwood tree, felt something close to peace. For the first time in her 26 years, she was not invisible. Someone had chosen her not for what she might become or what she could provide, but for exactly what she was. There was freedom in that, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. They rode for 3 hours, the sun tracking across the western sky, shadows lengthening across the trail. Ethan led without hesitation, every turn seemingly committed to memory, a map written in his bones after 15 years of traversing these paths. Finally, as the light began to take on the golden quality of late afternoon, they came around a bend and the landscape opened up before them. A high meadow, perhaps 5 acres of grass, surrounded by dense timber, stretched out like a secret pocket carved into the mountains. A creek ran clear and cold along the eastern edge, the water singing over smooth stones, probably fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. The meadow grass was just beginning to green up with spring growth, and wildflowers dotted the edges where the sun reached longest. The cabin sat in the center of the meadow, backed against the tree line for wind protection. It was exactly as Ethan had described it. One room built from squared pine logs that had weathered to a silvery gray, chinked tight with mud and moss. A stone chimney rose from one end, already sending up a thin thread of smoke. The roof was shake shingles, weathered but intact, shedding water rather than collecting it. One real glass window caught the afternoon light, a luxury this far from civilization. The door was made of thick planks that looked like they could withstand anything short of a determined bear. A covered porch stretched across the front, just deep enough to keep the rain and snow off. Behind the main cabin, Grace could see a lean-to for horses, a small smokehouse, what looked like a root cellar dug into the hillside. Furs hung stretched on frames, drying in the mountain air. Tools hung on wall pegs under the porch roof. Everything organized with the kind of precision that spoke of a man who lived alone and liked order. Ethan dismounted and stood watching her, waiting to see her reaction. Grace took her time, surveying what would now be her home with the same careful attention she had given to every important decision in her life. This was more than she had expected. She had imagined something cruder, more temporary. But this was substantial, built to last, the kind of structure a man raised when he intended to stay. "It's more than I expected," she said honestly. "It's not much," Ethan replied, moving to help her dismount. His hands were steady on her waist as she swung her bad leg over, catching her weight when the leg threatened to buckle after hours in the saddle. "But it's mine. Ours now." The word ours hung in the air between them, strange and new, and weighted with implications neither of them was quite ready to examine. He led the horses to the lean-to, showing her without words how things were organized, where the tack went, how the feed was stored. Grace followed, absorbing the information, filing it away in the same mental catalog where she kept everything else that might prove useful. The horses settled with obvious familiarity, and Ethan gave them each a measure of grain before leading Grace to the cabin itself. The interior was dim until he lit a lamp, and then it emerged from shadow with surprising warmth. One room as promised, but well organized, and clearly the home of someone who took pride in maintaining order. The bed was built into the far corner, substantial and wide, covered with buffalo robes and wool blankets that looked thick and warm. A table and 2 chairs sat near the fireplace, positioned to catch both heat and light. Shelves lined the walls holding supplies, tools, a surprising number of books. A trunk sat at the foot of the bed, wooden pegs for hanging clothes. The fireplace itself was well built, with a good crane for hanging pots and what looked like a bread oven built into the stonework. Everything was clean. Everything was in its place. This was not the chaotic bachelor quarters she might have expected, but rather the home of a man who understood that survival in this environment required discipline and attention to detail. "I'll show you where everything is," Ethan said, moving through the space with economical grace. "How things are organized. We can change whatever doesn't work for you, but this is what I've settled on over the years." He took her through the systems he had developed, where the root vegetables were stored in the cellar, how the meat was preserved in the smokehouse, which herbs and medicines he kept on hand and where, the spare ammunition, the emergency supplies in case of injury or unexpected weather. Everything had its place. Everything had its reason. Grace listened and observed and asked occasional questions, and Ethan answered with a directness she appreciated. There was no condescension in his explanations, no assumption that she would not understand or would not care about the technical details. He was treating her as a partner, as someone who needed to know these things to function effectively, and it was exactly what she had hoped for. When the tour was complete, they stood in the center of the single room and faced the reality that had been implicit all day, but was now unavoidable. The bed, the night ahead. The marriage that was now legally and morally binding but had not yet been physically consummated. Ethan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, in a way he had not been uncomfortable explaining trapline routes or ammunition storage. "That's the bed," he said, stating the obvious, because sometimes the obvious needed to be acknowledged before you could move past it. "I can sleep on the floor if you'd rather, or outside. Won't be the first time I've slept under the stars." Grace cut him off before he could continue building an excuse. "We're married. Pretending otherwise is foolish." His jaw worked as he considered her words. "Grace, I don't expect anything. We talked about this. I know what I said, what I promised. You don't owe me anything just because we said words in front of a preacher. I know what you expect and don't expect. We've been clear about that from the start. But this is a small cabin, and winter will come eventually, and sharing a bed is practical. It doesn't have to mean anything more than that, unless you want it to." Ethan studied her face, looking for something. Whatever he was seeking, he apparently found it because he nodded slowly. "All right, if you're comfortable with it." "I'm comfortable with being practical," Grace replied. The corner of Ethan's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I'm starting to notice that about you." They settled into an awkward routine for the rest of that first day. Grace made supper from the supplies Ethan had on hand, venison stew, because it seemed safe, and she knew how to make it well. The meat was high quality, properly preserved, and she found herself pleased with the state of his stores. Ethan clearly knew how to provide for himself and would not expect her to work miracles with inadequate supplies. They ate mostly in silence, both exhausted from the long day and the emotional weight of the changes they had set in motion. When full darkness came, and they could no longer avoid it, they faced the inevitable reality of the bed. Ethan banked the fire for the night while Grace changed into her nightdress behind a blanket he had hung across one corner without being asked, a small gesture of privacy that she appreciated more than she could express. Then she climbed into the bed, staying as far to one side as possible, leaving him plenty of room. The buffalo robes were soft against her skin, the wool blankets heavy and warm. The bed itself was more comfortable than what she had slept on at the trading post, the mattress thick with what felt like good quality ticking, stuffed with something that gave without being too soft. Ethan extinguished the lamp, and she heard him moving in the darkness, the rustle of clothes being removed, boots being set aside. Then the bed shifted as he climbed in from the far side, and suddenly they were lying there in the mountain darkness, with perhaps a foot of space between them, both rigid as fence posts, both staring up at rafters they could not see. The silence stretched out, broken only by the occasional pop from the banked fire and the eternal sound of the creek outside. It was Grace who finally broke it. "Ethan." "Yes." "Thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For choosing me. For bringing me here. For not making this harder than it has to be." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been emotion. "You're welcome. And thank you for taking the chance, for not expecting more than I can give, for being willing to build something real rather than holding out for pretty lies." "It makes sense to me," Grace said softly. "This arrangement, this partnership. It's more honest than most marriages I've seen." "Makes sense to me too," Ethan agreed. They lay there in the darkness, listening to the night sounds. The creek, the wind in the pines, an owl calling from somewhere close. Slowly, imperceptibly, they both began to relax, the stiffness leaving their bodies as exhaustion claimed what tension could not maintain. The space between them remained, but it no longer felt vast or unbridgeable. It felt more like a mutual respect for boundaries, a recognition that trust and comfort would come in their own time and could not be forced. Eventually, worn out by the long day and the emotional upheaval, they both slept. And if by morning they had shifted closer in their sleep, neither touching, but near enough to feel each other's warmth, neither of them mentioned it when they woke to the gray light of mountain dawn. The days that followed fell into a rhythm faster than Grace had expected. Ethan was up before dawn every morning, a habit formed by 15 years of solitary living and reinforced by the demands of running trap lines across 40 miles of mountain territory. Grace woke when he did, making coffee while he built up the fire, preparing something for him to eat before he headed out for the day's work. They would have breakfast together, not talking much, but settling into a comfortable pattern of shared morning routine. Then Ethan would head out sometimes for the full day, sometimes for multiple days when the distant trap lines needed checking. Grace would spend her days learning the rhythms of this new life, organizing the cabin to accommodate her presence, tending the small garden plot Ethan had carved out of the meadow, working on the endless tasks that mountain living required. She discovered that she was good at this life in ways that surprised them both. The isolation did not bother her. The work was hard, but no harder than what she had done at the trading post. And here she had the satisfaction of knowing she was building something that belonged to her as much as to Ethan. The cabin began to show small signs of her presence. Herbs hung drying from the rafters. The account books, which Ethan had kept in a rough but functional fashion, were reorganized with her more precise hand. Meals became more varied as she learned to work with the supplies and the wild foods available in the mountains. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks into their marriage, they sat together reviewing the accounts by lamplight. Ethan had been explaining his trading system, the relationships he had built with various Shoshone and Crow bands, the economics of the fur trade in an era when beaver was no longer king, but other pelts still commanded decent prices if you knew where to sell them. "You keep better books than I ever did," Ethan observed, studying her neat columns of figures. "You keep better trap lines than most men could manage," Grace replied, turning the compliment back to him. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps just recognition that she understood what he did and respected the skill it required. In that moment, Grace felt something shift between them, some small increment of trust being added to the foundation they were building. The partnership was working. They were good together in a way that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with complementary skills and mutual respect. But Grace knew that frontier life was never stable for long, that challenges would come, and the real test of their arrangement would be how they handled those challenges together. The first serious test came in the form of Buck Hendricks. Hendricks was a trapper who worked territory adjacent to Ethan's, a man in his mid-40s who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some long-ago accident. He had a reputation for being territorial and mean, especially when he had been drinking, which was more often than not. Ethan had mentioned him in passing, describing him as someone to be wary of, but not particularly worried about just another difficult neighbor in a country where neighbors were rare enough that you learned to tolerate their rough edges. Grace was hanging laundry in the yard, taking advantage of a sunny morning to wash the bedding when she heard horses approaching. 2 riders moving with the kind of deliberate pace that suggested they were not just passing through. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, watching as they came into the clearing. Ethan emerged from the lean-to where he had been working on some harness that needed repair. His posture changed when he saw who the visitors were, not quite tensing, but becoming more alert, more watchful. Buck Hendricks rode in the lead, his companion a younger man Grace did not recognize. "Blackwood," Hendricks called out without dismounting. His voice carried an edge that Grace recognized immediately as the prelude to trouble. "Need to talk to you about your trap lines." "Hendricks." Ethan acknowledged his tone, neutral but not welcoming. "What about them?" "Your eastern line, the one that runs along Beaver Creek. It's crossing onto my territory." Ethan's expression did not change, but Grace saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Creek's the boundary. Always has been. My lines are on my side, same as they've been for 10 years. You calling me a liar?" Hendricks's face flushed red, and Grace could smell the whiskey on him even from 15 feet away. "I'm saying you're mistaken. Or drunk. Possibly both." Hendrick's hand moved toward the knife at his belt, and the air suddenly crackled with the kind of tension that preceded violence. Grace moved without thinking, crossing to where the rifle leaned against the cabin wall, picking it up with the smooth economy of motion that her father had drilled into her years ago. She did not point it at anyone, just held it low and ready, her stance making it clear that she knew how to use it and would if necessary. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, her voice calm and steady, "my husband has told you where the lines are. Unless you have some kind of proof that contradicts his account, I think it's time for you to head home and sleep off whatever you've been drinking." Hendricks stared at her clearly, not accustomed to having women stand up to him, especially not women who held rifles with the kind of confidence that suggested they would actually pull the trigger if pushed. The younger man with him looked nervous, his horse dancing sideways as if sensing its rider's unease. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hendricks spat in the dirt, muttered something crude about women who did not know their place, and wheeled his horse around. He rode off without another word, but the look he shot back over his shoulder promised that this conversation was not finished. Grace stood holding the rifle until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely. Then she lowered it, suddenly aware that her hands were shaking slightly, though whether from fear or the after-effects of adrenaline she could not have said. Ethan walked over to her, his eyes on her face rather than on the departing riders. "You know how to use that?" he asked quietly. "Father taught me. I'm better with a rifle than I am with people." Something that looked like pride flickered across Ethan's weathered face. "I'm starting to see that. Thank you for backing me. That's what partners do." It was the first time he had called them partners without qualification, without it being a question or a theoretical concept. He said it like a simple statement of fact, and Grace felt something warm bloom in her chest. "We are partners, aren't we?" she said. "Yeah," Ethan replied, taking the rifle from her gently. We are. The physical distance between them had been maintained carefully in the week since the wedding. They shared the bed but did not touch. They worked side by side but did not linger. It was as if they were both waiting for something, though neither could have said exactly what. 3 weeks later, that waiting ended abruptly when Grace fell ill. It started innocuously enough, a cough that would not quite clear a scratch in her throat that felt like she had inhaled too much smoke. Grace dismissed it at first, kept working through the discomfort. Frontier wives did not have the luxury of being sick. There was too much work to do, too many things that could not be postponed. But by the second day, the cough had deepened, and her throat burned with every swallow. By the third day, chills were racking her body, despite the summer heat, and her head felt stuffed with wool. Mountain fever was a constant threat in this country. It could be anything from bad water to tick disease to one of a dozen other ailments that had no names but could kill you just as efficiently as anything with proper medical terminology. Grace tried to hide it. She kept working, kept maintaining the routines, unwilling to admit weakness or become a burden. But on the afternoon of the third day, she went to the creek to fetch water, and her legs simply gave out halfway back to the cabin. The bucket spilled the water soaking into the mountain grass, and Grace found herself on her hands and knees shaking so hard she could not stand her vision swimming with fever. She did not hear Ethan approach. He must have been closer to the cabin than she thought, must have been heading back from checking the nearby trap line. Suddenly he was there, his hands on her shoulders, his voice rough with something that might have been fear. "Grace, how long?" She tried to answer, found her teeth chattering too hard to form words. He did not wait for a response. He simply scooped her up, one arm under her knees and one behind her back, and carried her toward the cabin. She was vaguely aware of how light she must feel to him, how easy it was for him to carry her the quarter-mile back, and some distant part of her mind filed that information away as evidence of just how strong he actually was under those worn buckskins. He laid her in the bed with surprising gentleness, his rough hand checking her forehead. When he pulled it back, his expression was grim. "You're burning up. How long have you been sick?" "Few days," Grace managed through chattering teeth. His jaw clenched hard enough that she could see the muscle jump. "You should have told me." "Didn't want to be burden." "You're not a burden." The words came out fierce, almost angry. "You're my wife. That means I take care of you when you're sick. Do you understand me?" Grace managed to nod, though she was not sure she understood anything except that she was colder than she had ever been in her life. Despite the summer heat, and Ethan's face above her looked frightened in a way she would not have thought possible for a man like him. What followed were 5 days that blurred together into a nightmare of fever and chills and delirium. Grace retained only fragments. Ethan's face, stubbled and exhausted, appearing and disappearing, the bitter taste of willow bark tea being forced between her lips, cool cloths on her forehead when the fever spiked, his rough hand holding hers, anchoring her to the world when the delirium tried to pull her under. She did not know, would not know until much later, that Ethan never left her side during those 5 days, except to fetch water or gather more firewood or prepare the medicines he used to fight the fever. He sat beside the bed through endless hours, sometimes talking to her in that low, rough voice, sometimes just holding her hand, refusing to let her slip away into the darkness that kept calling to her. On the 4th night, when the fever was at its worst and Grace's breathing had become shallow and rapid, Ethan sat with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, and he prayed for the first time in 15 years. Not to any particular god, just to whatever force governed life and death in these mountains, asking, please, not this, not now, not when he had just found someone worth keeping. He did not realize he was speaking out loud until the words came tumbling out. "Don't die. Don't you dare die on me. Not now. Not after I finally found someone who fits. Someone who works. Someone who doesn't need me to be something I'm not. Just stay. Please." Deep in her fever, Grace heard those words. They registered somewhere in the part of her consciousness that was still fighting, still clinging to life. She could not respond, could not even open her eyes, but she heard them, and they mattered. On the morning of the 5th day, the fever broke. Grace woke to gray dawn light filtering through the cabin's single window, her body weak as a newborn kitten, but her mind clear for the first time in days. Ethan was asleep in the chair beside the bed, still wearing the same clothes he had worn for days, his beard grown wild, exhaustion carved into every line of his face. His hand was wrapped around hers, even in sleep, maintaining that connection, as if he needed to feel her pulse to know she was still alive. Grace lay there for a long time just looking at him, this hard man who had married her for practical reasons, who had told her he could not offer love. This man who had just spent 5 days and nights nursing her through a fever that could easily have killed her, who had barely slept or eaten, who had refused to leave her side even when there was nothing more he could do than wait and hope. His actions spoke louder than any words ever could. When Ethan finally woke, their eyes met across the small distance between bed and chair. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief, "Don't do that again." "I'll try not to." Grace managed her voice barely more than a whisper. "You scared the hell out of me. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." He paused, struggling with words that did not come easily. "Just don't die. I couldn't stand it if you died." Grace asked the question before she could stop herself. "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the answer, with emotions he had not expected to feel and did not know how to name. "I don't know," he said finally, honestly. "But somewhere in the last few weeks you stopped being a convenient arrangement and started being mine. And I don't give up what's mine." It was not a declaration of love. It was something more primitive than that, something more fundamental. Possession, claim, the acknowledgement that she had become important to him in ways he could not fully articulate but could no longer deny. Tears pricked Grace's eyes, the first tears she had shed in years. "I'm yours, and you're mine. Is that all right?" Ethan leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers, careful not to put his full weight on her weakened body. "Yeah, that's all right." Then he kissed her gentle, because she was still weak, but with a tenderness that made her breath catch and her heart pound despite her exhaustion. When he pulled back, something fundamental had shifted between them. They were not strangers sharing space anymore. They were becoming something else, something neither had words for yet, but both recognized as worth protecting. The week after Grace recovered, Ethan hovered in ways he tried to hide but could not quite manage. He would not let her do heavy work. He brought her food without being asked. He sat with her in the evenings, talking more than he had before, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack and crumble. He told her the full story of Catherine, filling in details he had glossed over before. How he had believed she loved him, how he had planned their entire future in meticulous detail, how the note she left had shattered something in him that he thought could never be repaired. How he had come west, not to seek his fortune, but to run from the pain, and how the mountains had given him something that Pennsylvania never could have. Purpose. Achievement. The satisfaction of building something with his own hands that would outlast him. "I thought that was enough," he said one evening as they sat outside watching the stars emerge over the peaks. "Empire without anyone to share it with. I told myself I didn't need anything else. But when you were sick, when I thought I might lose you, I realized how empty it all was. Money in the bank and trap lines and a cabin in the mountains, but nobody to care if I lived or died except as a business concern." Grace shared her own stories in return. Growing up in Rose's shadow, realizing early that she would never be the pretty one, the chosen one, and learning to make peace with being useful instead. The rattlesnake bite when she was 8 years old. How she had thought she was dying, how the venom had withered the muscles in her calf but left her alive, the birthmark she had been born with, and the casual cruelty of other children. "I learned to make my home in the shadows," she said, "became so good at being invisible that sometimes I forgot I existed. Until you looked at me and saw something worth choosing. You're not in the shadows anymore," Ethan said, his rough hand finding hers in the darkness. "Not with me." One morning, about a month into their marriage, Ethan left before dawn to check a distant trap line, a journey that would keep him away overnight. Grace spent the day working in the garden, taking advantage of the mild weather to get several weeks of work done while conditions were favorable. She was kneeling among the vegetables, pulling weeds and checking for pests, when she heard a rustling in the tree line. She looked up to see a black bear, perhaps 300 pounds, standing at the edge of the clearing. It was testing the air, clearly attracted by the smell from the smokehouse where several sides of venison hung curing. Grace froze. Her father had taught her the basics of dealing with bears. Never run. Running triggered their chase instinct, and you could not outrun them anyway. Make yourself look large. Make noise. Back away slowly if possible. Fight only as a last resort, because you would probably lose. She stood slowly, her heart hammering in her chest, and began backing toward the cabin where the rifle leaned against the wall. The bear dropped to all fours, tracking her movement, not charging, but assessing the situation. Grace reached the rifle, picked it up, her movements smooth despite the adrenaline flooding her system. But she did not aim it at the bear. Instead, she grabbed the large iron pot that hung by the door and began banging it with a ladle, the noise echoing off the mountains. Go on! Get out of here!" She advanced slowly, still banging the pot, making herself as large and loud and intimidating as possible. The bear hesitated, clearly torn between the attraction of the smokehouse and the threat of this noisy creature approaching it. Grace kept advancing, kept making noise, her voice steady despite the fear. "You're not welcome here. This is my home. Get." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than a minute, the bear decided the potential meal was not worth the trouble. It turned and lumbered back into the timber, disappearing into the shadows as if it had never been there. Grace stood in the yard, the pot still in one hand and the rifle in the other, her entire body shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. She had just faced down a bear, alone, and she had won. When Ethan returned that evening, she told him about it, trying to keep her voice casual, as if confronting bears was just another part of mountain life. His response surprised her. He looked at her with something close to wonder. "Most people would have run or frozen. You stood your ground. You said weak things don't survive here. I'm not weak." "No." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her for the first time outside the context of the bed, just holding her like she was precious, like she mattered. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for, stronger than most men I know." That night, he held her close in the bed, not sexually but protectively, his body curved around hers as if he could shield her from every danger the mountains might offer. And Grace, for the first time in her life, felt truly safe. By autumn, they had found their rhythm, and it was a good one. Grace thrived in the high country in ways that surprised them both. She was tougher than she looked, more resilient than anyone had given her credit for. Her limp barely bothered her in the mountains, or perhaps she had simply stopped letting it define her capabilities. She learned to ride well, to shoot straight, to read weather patterns in the clouds and animal behavior in the tracks they left. The isolation that might have driven some women mad gave her peace. There were no comparisons up here, no Rose to measure herself against, no neighbors to judge her appearance or her worth. There was only the work and the mountains and Ethan, and that was enough. The small mountain community, scattered as it was across vast distances, accepted her quickly. Other trappers' wives, Shoshone women who had married white men, the handful of hardy souls who called this wilderness home. They recognized competence when they saw it, respected quiet strength. Grace was no longer the overlooked sister. She was Blackwood's woman, and that identity carried weight in a place where reputation mattered more than appearance. One evening in late September, when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first real bite of coming winter, they heard horses approaching. Ethan's hand went to his rifle automatically, then relaxed when he recognized the rider. "Just Red Cameron," he said. Red Cameron was a lean man in his early 30s with a laugh that could carry across ridges and a reputation for being reliable in a country where reliability could mean the difference between life and death. He rode into the clearing with his usual easy grace, but Grace's attention was immediately drawn to the figure riding behind him. Rose. Her sister sat awkwardly in the saddle, clearly uncomfortable on horseback, overdressed for the mountains, in a traveling outfit that would have been more appropriate in Denver. Her face was tight with exhaustion, and even from a distance Grace could see the desperation beneath the carefully maintained facade. "Found this lady at Fort Bridger," Red called out, helping Rose dismount with the kind of exaggerated care usually reserved for handling fine china. "Said she was your sister-in-law, Ethan. Figured I'd bring her up since I was heading this way anyhow. She's been staying at the McMurray place down valley. Thought you'd want to know she was in the territory." Rose's eyes swept across the scene before her. The rough cabin, the meadow. Grace in her worn work dress and practical moccasins, her hands stained from digging potatoes, her hair in a simple braid. No artifice, no pretense, just honest work, honestly done. When Rose smiled, it was sharp enough to draw blood. "My goodness, Grace, how very frontier you've become." Frontier hospitality was not optional, no matter how unwelcome the guest. Ethan's face had gone carefully neutral, but Grace could see the wariness in his eyes. They fed Rose venison stew, and cornbread gave her the bed while they took blankets by the fire. The cabin felt too small with Rose in it, her presence filling every corner with barely concealed contempt, and something darker that Grace recognized but did not want to name. Jealousy, regret, perhaps both. The next day was worse. Rose filled the small cabin with observations wrapped in honey, each one designed to wound. "You look so tired, Grace. All this work must be exhausting. Do you really do everything yourself? Surely Ethan could afford to hire help." "I simply couldn't live this way. So far from civilization, from society, from anything resembling culture. Don't you miss it? Don't you miss beauty?" Grace absorbed it all in silence, but she noticed that Ethan's face grew progressively harder, with each comment his jaw tightening in that way that suggested he was exercising considerable restraint. By the second evening, the tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. They were preparing supper, Grace chopping vegetables, while Ethan cleaned a rifle that did not need cleaning when Rose made her move. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying that familiar poisonous sweetness, "I've been wanting to speak with you privately, about Grace's condition." Ethan's hands stilled on the rifle. "Anything you need to say, you can say in front of Grace." "It's rather delicate." Rose's smile had teeth now. "About her health, her ability to give you what a man needs from a wife." Grace's hands froze on the vegetables. She felt ice spreading through her chest. "What condition?" Ethan's voice was carefully neutral. Rose leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "Oh, hasn't she told you the rumors back home, about the fever she had as a child? They say it damaged her, left her barren, that she'll never be able to give you children. I thought you should know before you invested too much in this arrangement. After all, what good is a wife who can't provide you with heirs?" The silence that followed was absolute. Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind moving in the pines outside, could hear the world continuing despite the fact that her own world had just cracked down the middle. This was it, the moment Ethan would realize his mistake, that he had married damaged goods. That practical did not matter if she could not give him the most basic thing a frontier marriage was supposed to provide, sons to inherit the empire he had built, a legacy to outlast his own life. Ethan set down the rifle with deliberate care. He stood slowly, his movements controlled and precise, and looked at Rose with eyes colder than any mountain winter. "Get out." Rose blinked, her triumphant smile faltering. "I beg your pardon." "You heard me. Get your things. Red's leaving at first light. You go with him, and don't come back." Rose's face went white, then flushed an ugly red. "But I was only trying to help. Surely you deserve to know the truth about what kind of wife you've married." Ethan took a step toward her, and something in his movement made Rose back up instinctively. There was no violence in his posture, but there was an absolute certainty, a finality that could not be argued with or negotiated away. "You came here to cause trouble," he said, his voice low and hard as mountain granite. "To hurt Grace. To drive a wedge between us so you could what? Take her place. Did you really think that would work? Rose opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan cut her off. You're beautiful, I won't deny that, but you're also cruel and small and so eaten up with jealousy that you can't stand seeing your sister happy. You look at what we've built here, and all you can see is what you think you should have had. But you know what you would have done with this life? You would have lasted one winter. Maybe. Then you would have run back to civilization, complaining about how hard it all was, how rough I was, how much you deserved better. He moved back to where Grace stood frozen by the table, her hand still gripping the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. He did not touch her yet, but his presence beside her was a statement in itself. Grace is still standing here, still working, still building something real. That's the difference between you and her. You want the result without the work. You want the empire without the building. You want to be chosen without being worthy of the choosing. Rose's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of rage rather than sorrow. Happy. You think she's happy living in a shack in the wilderness, married to a man who doesn't even love her. And there it was, the question that had been hovering unspoken between them for months. The assumption that their practical arrangement was somehow less than a real marriage because it had not started with declarations of love. Ethan turned to look at Grace, and his voice when he spoke was quiet but carried the weight of absolute truth. Who says I don't love her? Grace's head snapped up. Rose's mouth fell open. Even Ethan looked slightly surprised that he had said it out loud, but having said it, he did not take it back or soften it. Instead, he turned fully to face Grace, his weathered face more open than she had ever seen it. Things change, he said, speaking directly to her now, ignoring Rose completely. What I wanted changed. What I feel changed. I didn't plan on it, didn't want it if I'm being honest. Thought that part of me was dead and buried with Catherine's note. But somewhere between that first day when I saw you stacking wood and now you stopped being a convenient arrangement and started being necessary. His voice roughened with emotion he was no longer trying to hide. You think I don't love you? I can't breathe right when you're not in the room. I wake up in the night just to make sure you're still there beside me. When you were sick, when that fever had you, I would have traded everything I own, this cabin, the trap lines, every dollar in the bank, every pelt I've ever taken, just to keep you breathing. So don't tell me I don't love you. Grace felt tears streaming down her face the first time Ethan had seen her cry since the fever. She could not speak, could barely breathe, could only stand there staring at this hard man who had just torn himself open in front of her sister to defend what they had built together. Ethan looked back at Rose, his expression returning to that cold neutrality that was somehow more devastating than anger. I don't care if Grace can't have children. We'll make do. We'll be enough for each other. But I do care that she thought I wouldn't want her if she couldn't. That's on you, Rose. On you and your mother and everyone else who made her feel like her only value was in what she could give to others instead of who she was. He moved to Grace, then his rough hands cupping her face with surprising gentleness, tilting her head up so she had to meet his eyes. You're not invisible. You're not second choice. You're everything I didn't know I needed, everything I didn't know I was looking for when I rode down to that trading post. You understand me? Grace managed to nod, though she still could not find words. He kissed her then, fierce and claiming, in front of Rose, in front of God and the mountains and the whole wide world. When he pulled back, he kept his eyes locked on Grace's face, speaking only to her. You're mine, and I'm yours, and that's all that matters. The rest is just noise. Only then did he turn back to Rose, his voice flat and final. Leave, now. Red will be here at first light tomorrow. Be ready. Rose stood there for another moment, her face working through a complicated series of emotions. Shock, fury, and perhaps buried deep beneath the other feelings, something that might have been recognition of her own culpability in how this had all turned out. She had come here expecting to expose Grace's inadequacy. Instead, she had witnessed something she had never experienced herself and probably never would. A man choosing his wife fully and completely, not for what she could give him, but for who she was. Without another word, Rose gathered what remained of her dignity and retreated to the corner of the cabin where her traveling bag sat. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Ethan returned to the rifle he had been cleaning, his movements methodical and calm. Grace went back to preparing supper, though her hands were shaking so badly she had to set down the knife twice. They did not speak for the rest of the evening. Rose sat in the corner, her presence a dark cloud they both pointedly ignored. When supper was ready, they ate in near silence. When darkness fell, Ethan and Grace took their blankets outside and made a camp under the stars, leaving Rose the cabin. They lay side by side in their bedrolls, close enough to touch but not quite touching, looking up at the vast sweep of stars overhead. The creek sang its eternal song. An owl called from the dark timber. The mountains stood sentinel around them, indifferent and eternal. "Did you mean it?" Grace asked finally, her voice barely more than a whisper. "What you said? Every word?" "When did you know?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice carried the rough honesty that had become the foundation of everything between them. "Truthfully, that first day. When I saw you working, thinking ahead, not complaining or looking for sympathy. Something in me just knew, but I didn't let myself feel it until you were sick. Until I sat there for 5 days watching you fight that fever and realized that if you died, everything I'd built would mean nothing. The cabin would just be wood and stone. The trap lines would just be work. None of it would matter without you there to share it with." Grace turned her head to look at him, this hard man who had just spoken words more tender than any poetry. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have since that day by the creek when you told me the truth about what you could and couldn't offer. Nobody ever did that before. Nobody ever respected me enough to be that honest." Ethan rolled to face her, his hand finding hers in the darkness between their bedrolls. "I can't promise it'll always be easy. This life we're building. It's hard, and it's going to stay hard. But I can promise you'll never be alone in it. I can promise you'll always matter. That's worth something, isn't it?" "That's worth everything," Grace said. He kissed her then, and this kiss was different from all the ones before. This was not formal or tentative or even fierce. This was tender, deep, full of promise and possibility. When he pulled back, his hand stayed cupped against her cheek. "Come here," he said softly, and she did, leaving her bedroll to join him in his arms coming around her as the mountain night settled over them like a blanket. That night under the stars they became husband and wife, in truth not just in name or legal contract, but in the complete joining of two people who had chosen each other fully and without reservation. It was not the passionate urgency of young love, but something deeper and more lasting. The kind of intimacy built on trust and respect and honest recognition of each other's worth. When Grace woke the next morning wrapped in Ethan's arms with the dawn breaking pink and gold over the eastern peaks, she felt something she had never felt in all her 26 years. Complete, whole, chosen not despite her flaws, but including them as part of the full picture of who she was. They heard Red Cameron's horse before they saw him, giving them time to dress and make themselves presentable. By the time he rode into the clearing, they were standing together in front of the cabin, a united front, while Rose emerged with her traveling bag, looking pale and exhausted. Red helped her mount with his usual courtesy, but even his easy humor was muted this morning. He could sense the tension, could tell that something significant had shifted in the night. He nodded to Ethan, and Grace touched his hat brim in farewell and led Rose's horse down the trail toward the valley. They never saw Rose again. Years later, they would hear through the mountain grapevine that she had married a wealthy merchant in Denver, a man 20 years her senior, who gave her the fine house and fine clothes and social position she had always craved. The reports suggested she was comfortable, but not happy, that she moved through her privileged life with a kind of empty grace, like a beautiful ship sailing on a windless sea. But that was years in the future. On this morning, Ethan and Grace simply stood and watched until the riders disappeared around the bend in the trail, and then they turned back to their cabin and their life and the work that was always waiting. The winter that followed was the hardest in a decade. The snow came early and stayed late, piling up against the cabin walls until the drifts reached halfway up the door. There were weeks when they could not leave the cabin at all, when the world contracted to the space of those 14 by 16 feet, and the only sounds were the howl of wind and the crackle of the fire. But the cabin was warm, and their supplies held out, and they had each other, and that made all the difference. They talked through the long evenings by firelight, sharing stories and dreams and plans for the future in ways they never had before. The walls that had existed between them, the careful boundaries and maintained distances, had dissolved that night under the stars, and now they moved through the confined space of the cabin with an easy intimacy that felt as natural as breathing. Ethan told her about growing up in Pennsylvania coal country, about his father dying in a mine collapse when Ethan was 12, about his mother working herself to death by the time she was 40. He told her about coming west at 20 with nothing but a horse and a rifle, and a bone-deep need to prove that he could build something that would last, that he was more than just another expendable worker in someone else's operation. "I wanted to leave a mark," he said one night as they lay together listening to the wind scream outside. "Something that would outlast me. An empire, I guess, though that sounds grandiose when you say it out loud, but something real, something that mattered." "You've built that," Grace said. "These trap lines, this cabin, the relationships with the trading posts and the tribes, it's substantial. It would outlast you even if you died tomorrow. But who would inherit it? That's what I finally understood that winter before I came looking for you. An empire without an heir is just a temporary arrangement. When I die, it all dissolves. The trap lines get claimed by whoever's strong enough to hold them. The cabin goes to ruin. The relationships fade. It's like I was never here at all." He pulled her closer, his chin resting on top of her head. "That's why I needed a partner. Not just for the work, though God knows the work is endless, but for the building, for creating something that could last beyond one lifetime. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Grace said. "It's what we're all looking for, isn't it? Some way to matter. Some proof that we were here, and what we did had value." They planned together through those long winter nights, mapping out the next 5 years, the next 10. Where to expand the trap lines, how to diversify beyond furs to other trading opportunities, whether to build a small trading post of their own down in the valley where the wagon routes were starting to shift back through, what to plant in the expanded garden come spring, how to improve the cabin, add those extra rooms they would need if their partnership bore fruit in the form of children. It was during one of those planning sessions in early January that the worst blizzard of the season hit. They had known it was coming. Ethan could read the signs in the clouds and the behavior of the animals, the way the horses had been restless and the birds had disappeared from the tree line. But even forewarned, the ferocity of the storm when it arrived was shocking. The wind howled like something alive and angry, driving snow so thick and fast that visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plummeted. The cabin groaned under the assault, and even with the fire, banked high cold seeped through every crack and gap in the chinking. On the second day of the storm, Ethan announced he needed to check the horses in the lean-to. The wind had torn part of the roof off during the night, and he was worried about the animals. "I'll be quick," he said, bundling into his heaviest coat. 15 minutes at most. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to tell him to wait, but she understood that the horses could not be left without shelter in this weather. They were not just transportation, they were survival itself. If something happened to those horses, they would be trapped here until spring, with no way to get supplies or help if something went wrong. "Be careful," was all she said, and he kissed her quickly before pushing out into the whiteout. 15 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. Grace stood by the window, though she could see nothing through the wall of white, her anxiety mounting with each passing minute. Something was wrong. Ethan would not take this long unless something had gone seriously wrong. She made the decision quickly before fear could paralyze her. She dressed in every layer she owned, took the rifle, took a lantern, though it would barely penetrate the blizzard, and took a coil of rope from its peg by the door. She tied one end of the rope to the porch post. The other end she tied around her waist. This way, even if she got disoriented in the whiteout, she could follow the rope back to safety. The moment she stepped off the porch, the wind nearly knocked her over. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing her breath. She could not see more than a few feet in any direction. Everything was white wind and biting cold. She pushed toward the lean-to, or where she thought the lean-to should be calling Ethan's name, though the wind tore the words from her mouth before they could travel more than a few feet. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and her bad leg ached with every step, but she did not stop. She nearly missed him. He was 20 yards from the lean-to, half buried in a drift, and she only saw him because of his dark coat against the white. She stumbled toward him, falling to her knees beside him. "Ethan!" She shook him, and his eyes opened confused and unfocused. Hypothermia. He was already hypothermic, had probably been out here for close to 2 hours. The horse must have gotten loose, and he had tried to catch it, gotten turned around in the storm, unable to find his way back. Grace grabbed him under the arms and hauled with all her strength, adrenaline lending her power she did not normally possess. She got him to his feet, or mostly to his feet, supporting most of his weight as she oriented them toward where the rope should be. Finding the rope was the longest 5 minutes of her life. She swept through the snow with one hand while holding Ethan upright with the other, her fingers numb her face, frozen her lungs burning with the cold. Then her fingers touched hemp, and she almost sobbed with relief. Following the rope back to the cabin, half-dragging Ethan's considerable weight, was harder than anything she had ever done. Her bad legs screamed in protest. Her muscles burned. But she did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant death for both of them. When they finally stumbled onto the porch and through the door, they collapsed together in a heap. Grace managed to kick the door shut behind them, managed to get Ethan close to the fire, managed to strip off his wet clothes with shaking hands and wrap him in every blanket they owned. She made coffee, forced the hot liquid between his blue lips, rubbed his frozen hands and feet to restore circulation. And only when his eyes cleared and focused on her face did she allow herself to collapse beside him, exhausted beyond anything she had ever felt. "You came out in that..." His voice was rough and confused. "Could have died." "So could you," Grace said. "And I wasn't about to lose you." "Foolish woman," he said, but he was smiling, and he pulled her into the nest of blankets with him holding her close. "Foolish, brave, incredible woman." "You're mine," Grace said simply. "That means I don't let you die in a blizzard if I can help it." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "First time anyone's called me beautiful," she said. "Should have said it sooner," Ethan replied. "Been true for months." They lay there by the fire, wrapped in blankets and each other, while the storm raged on outside. And Grace understood with perfect clarity that this was what their life would be: hard, dangerous, demanding everything they had to give, but also rich in ways that had nothing to do with money or comfort, rich in the things that actually mattered: partnership, trust, the absolute certainty that they would fight for each other, always. Winter held the high country in its grip, and Grace and Ethan spent the long evenings by the fire, their intimacy deepening with each passing day. By late November, about 2 months after that night under the stars, Grace had begun to notice changes in her body. She dismissed them at first. Her courses had never been entirely regular, and the stress of the hard winter could easily account for missing a month. But when the second month passed with no sign, and she started waking with morning nausea, and her breasts became tender enough that even the brush of her dress was uncomfortable, she began to allow herself to consider the possibility. She was pregnant. The realization hit her one morning in early April as she stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the eastern peaks in shades of pink and gold. She placed her hand on her still flat belly and felt a surge of emotion so complex she could not begin to untangle it. Joy, terror, wonder, disbelief. The doctors had been wrong, or Rose had been lying, or perhaps neither, and this was simply one of those inexplicable things that happened. Sometimes the human body refusing to conform to expectations or predictions. She carried the knowledge alone for several days, partly because she wanted to be absolutely certain before telling Ethan, partly because she was afraid of his reaction. What if he was disappointed? What if fatherhood was not something he actually wanted, despite all his talk about legacy and heirs? What if the reality of a child made him regret their arrangement? But secrets were corrosive, especially between people who had built their relationship on honesty, and Grace could not carry this one for long. One evening after supper, as Ethan sat by the fire working on a trap that needed repair, she moved to sit beside him, her heart hammering in her chest. "Ethan," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, his hand stilling on the trap, his expression shifting to concern. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Something's right, actually. Something I didn't think could happen." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, holding it there, waiting for understanding to dawn. It took him a moment, his rough palm warm through the fabric of her dress, and then his eyes widened and his breath caught. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. All the signs are there. I'm about 2 months along, I think." "But Rose said the doctors said." "The doctors were wrong. Or I was wrong about what they said. Or maybe it's just one of those things that happen sometimes despite what everyone thinks they know. But I'm carrying your child, Ethan. Our child." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through shocked disbelief and finally settling on something that looked like pure wonder. His hand on her belly trembled slightly. "A baby," he said, testing the words as if they were a foreign language he was only just learning to speak. "We're going to have a baby." Then he pulled her close, and Grace felt him shake his arms wrapped around her with a fierce tenderness that told her everything she needed to know about his reaction. This was not disappointment. This was not regret. This was a man being given something he had desperately wanted but had convinced himself he would never have. "Are you scared?" she asked, when he finally pulled back enough to look at her face. "Terrified," he admitted without hesitation. "I don't know the first thing about being a father. My own father died when I was 12, and I can barely remember what he was like. What if I'm no good at it? What if I make all the wrong choices?" "We'll figure it out together," Grace said. "The same way we've figured out everything else. One day at a time, learning as we go." He placed both hands on her belly now, as if he could somehow feel the tiny life growing there, even though it was far too early for that. "Grace, I never thought I'd have this. A family. A real family, not just an empire to pass on, but actual children to raise and teach and watch grow. You've given me everything. Everything I didn't know I needed, everything I thought I'd lost the right to have." "We gave each other everything," Grace corrected gently. "That's what partnership means." That night they lay awake long after the fire had burned down to coals, talking about the future in concrete terms now. Names for the baby, though they agreed it was too early to settle on anything final. How to prepare the cabin for a child. Whether they would need to find a midwife, or if Grace's knowledge of healing and Ethan's steady hands would be enough when the time came. What kind of parents they wanted to be, what values they wanted to pass on. "I want to teach them the truth," Ethan said. "Ethan, that life is hard and you survive it by being tougher than the hardness, but also that hard doesn't mean mean. You can be strong and still be kind, practical and still be loving. That's what you've taught me. And I want to teach them that being useful is good, but it's not the same as being valued," Grace said. "That their worth isn't measured by what they can do for others, but by who they are in themselves. That being chosen matters more than being perfect." The pregnancy progressed through winter and into spring and summer without major complications. Grace continued to work, though Ethan watched her like a hawk and would not let her lift anything heavy or take any unnecessary risks. He brought her whatever she needed, adjusted his trapline schedule to stay closer to the cabin, made plans to bring Beth McMurray up from the valley when Grace's time came. By autumn, Grace's belly had swelled to the point where her movements were awkward and her balance uncertain. By October, she could no longer see her feet, but she felt strong, felt healthy, felt ready for whatever came next. The baby came on a cold morning in early November, just as the first serious snow of the season was beginning to fall. The labor started in the night, a tightening across Grace's belly that woke her from sleep and had her gasping with the unexpected intensity. Ethan woke instantly, a habit from 15 years of sleeping light in dangerous country. "Is it time?" "I think so." Grace managed between contractions. "You should ride for Beth." He dressed faster than she had ever seen anyone dress, was on his horse, and gone into the pre-dawn darkness before Grace could catch her breath. The ride to the McMurray place would take him at least 2 hours at speed, and then 2 hours back. She would labor alone for at least 4 hours, probably longer. Grace was not afraid. She had assisted at enough births, animal and human, to know what was coming. It would hurt. It might be dangerous. But women had been doing this since the dawn of time, and she was strong, and she would endure. The pain came in waves, building to peaks that took her breath away, then receding to allow her to rest and gather strength for the next one. She paced the cabin when she could, leaned against the table when standing became too much, tried to remember everything she had read in her father's medical texts and everything she had learned from Morning Star. Ethan returned with Beth McMurray just after dawn, both of them snow-covered from the storm that was rapidly intensifying. Beth was a woman in her 40s who had birthed 6 children of her own and attended the births of at least a dozen more. She took one look at Grace and smiled. "You're doing fine, honey. Better than fine. This is going to be one of the easy ones, I can tell." It did not feel easy. The pain intensified as the morning wore on, the contractions coming closer together, lasting longer, leaving less time to recover between them. But Beth stayed calm and encouraging, and Ethan, after being banished from the cabin to pace on the porch like a caged animal, provided a steadying presence even in his absence. As midday approached and the snow fell heavier, Beth examined Grace and nodded with satisfaction. "Almost there, honey. Another hour, maybe less. You're strong. You're doing everything right. This baby's coming whether we're ready or not." The final stage came in a rush of pain and pressure, and overwhelming sensation that Grace could never have adequately described to someone who had not experienced it. There was a moment when she was certain she could not do this, could not possibly endure another second, and then Beth was urging her to push, and her body was responding without conscious thought. And suddenly there was a wail splitting the air, a baby's cry, sharp and clear and furious at being born into this cold world. "It's a girl," Beth announced, her hands quick and competent as she cleaned the tiny creature and wrapped her in soft cloth. "Healthy lungs on this one. She's perfect, Grace, just perfect." Beth placed the baby in Grace's arms, and Grace stared down at the impossibly small face, the tiny fingers curled into fists, the eyes that would eventually be gray like her own, but right now were the unfocused dark blue of all newborns. Her daughter, hers and Ethan's. Proof that sometimes the doctors were wrong and miracles happened, and hope was not always foolish. "Can I send him in now?" Beth asked, and Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Ethan came through the door, moving like he was approaching something sacred, his weather-beaten face showing every one of his nearly 40 years, and then some. Beth placed the baby in his arms, and he held her with the kind of exaggerated care usually reserved for handling explosives. He looked down at his daughter, this tiny human who shared his blood and his future, and tears ran down his weathered cheeks. Grace had never seen him cry before the fever, and then only briefly. But now he wept openly, unashamed, holding his daughter like she was the most precious thing in the world, which Grace supposed she was. "She's perfect," he whispered. "She's ours. How is she ours?" "Because miracles happen," Grace said, "even when we don't expect them." "What do we call her?" Ethan asked, and Grace could hear in his voice that he had already thought about this, had probably spent the last 4 hours pacing and thinking and planning. "You choose," she said. "You've built everything else. You should name her too." Ethan looked down at his daughter, then back at Grace, with eyes that held more emotion than she had ever seen him express. "Hope," he said. "We'll call her Hope, because that's what you gave me when I had given up on ever having anything like this. Hope that I could be more than just a man alone in the mountains." Hope that there could be something worth building beyond an empire. Hope that love was real even when it didn't announce itself with pretty words. Grace felt tears streaming down her own face now. Hope Blackwood. It's perfect. Beth left the next day when the storm cleared, promising to return in a week to check on them, but pronouncing both mother and baby healthy and likely to stay that way. Ethan paid her generously, more than she asked for, because some things were beyond price. The weeks that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Hope was a good baby as babies went, though she made her needs known with the same fierce determination her father showed in everything he did. Ethan proved surprisingly adept at the practical tasks of fatherhood, changing the cloth diapers without complaint, walking the floor with her when she fussed, learning to read her different cries and respond appropriately. Grace watched him become a father and fell in love with him all over again. Deeper this time, rooted in the recognition of what kind of man he truly was beneath all the rough edges and carefully maintained walls. He was gentle. He was patient. He talked to Hope like she could understand him, explaining the world to her in his rough voice, making promises about what he would teach her when she was old enough to learn. The winter passed, and spring came again, and Hope grew from a tiny newborn to a chubby baby with her father's dark hair and her mother's gray eyes. They fell into new rhythms, reorganized their lives around this small person who had become the center of their world. More children followed in the years after Hope. Daniel, born 2 years later with his father's serious expression and his mother's quiet intensity. Emma, 2 years after Daniel, a sunny child who laughed more than she cried. And finally Thomas, born when Grace was 33 and Ethan was 46, their surprise blessing the child they had not planned but welcomed with the same joy as all the others. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. Ethan added 2 more rooms, then a proper second story, transforming the simple one-room structure into something that could almost be called a house. The trapline operation expanded as well. They opened a small trading post down in the valley, taking advantage of the shifting wagon routes. Ethan trained younger trappers, building relationships that ensured his knowledge would be passed on even as his own trips into the high country became less frequent. They prospered not in the way of great wealth or social prominence, but in the quiet way of people who work hard and build wisely and do not quit when things get difficult. The mountains were generous to those who respected them and brutal to those who did not, and Ethan and Grace had learned that lesson well. 7 years after that November morning when Hope was born on an autumn afternoon warm enough to work outside but cool enough to hint at the coming winter, Red Cameron rode into the clearing with mail from Fort Bridger. Hope, now 7 years old, was helping her mother tend the expanded herb garden. Daniel, 5, was learning to set traps under his father's patient instruction. Emma, 3, was collecting pine cones with the intense focus only small children can muster. Baby Thomas, 6 months old, slept in a cradle on the porch. Red handed over the bundle of letters and news sheets, accepted coffee and conversation, and rode off again with a wave and a promise to return before the snow closed the high passes for the winter. Among the letters was one from Margaret Hartwell, the first communication they had received from her in almost 2 years. Grace opened it while Ethan watched both of them, curious about what could have prompted the widow to write after so long. The news was simple. Margaret was selling the trading post, finally admitting what everyone had known for years, that she could not run it alone and it was time to let it go. She was moving to Denver to live with Rose, who had married a wealthy merchant and had room in her fine house for an aging mother. Grace read that part twice, then looked up at Ethan. "Do you want to go back? Help her with the sale? She's still my mother after all." Ethan considered it seriously before shaking his head. "What do you want to do?" Grace looked around at the cabin, at the meadow, at her children playing and working and sleeping in the mountain sunshine. Looked at Ethan, weathered and worn, but still strong, still solid, still the man who had chosen her when no one else would. "My home is here," she said simply. "With you, with our children. This is where I belong." She read the rest of the letter, which included news about Rose. The marriage had been advantageous, providing Rose with the comfort and social position she had always craved. But Margaret's careful words suggested it was not a happy union. Rose moved through her privileged life with a kind of empty grace, hosting parties and wearing fine clothes, and never quite seeming satisfied with what she had achieved. "Mother says Rose seems empty," Grace told Ethan. "Like she has everything, but it means nothing." Ethan looked at their children, at the home they had built, at Grace herself, with her work-roughened hands and sun-weathered face, and eyes that shone with genuine contentment. "I'd rather have meaning than everything." "We have both," Grace said, moving to stand beside him, his arm coming around her shoulders in the easy gesture of long familiarity. "We have meaning, and we have everything that actually matters." That evening, after the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet except for the crackle of the fire, Grace found the old note Ethan had given her that day by the creek so many years ago. She had kept it tucked in her Bible, taking it out occasionally to read when she needed reminding of how far they had come. His rough handwriting still spoke across the years. "Your absence bothers me more than your presence should. I don't understand it, but it's true." Grace smiled, took a pencil, and wrote beneath it in her own careful script. "And your presence became my home. Forever grateful I said yes." She tucked the note back into the Bible and went to the door where Ethan stood looking out at the stars beginning to emerge over the mountain peaks. She joined him, and his arm came around her, automatically pulling her close. "Happy?" he asked, as he sometimes did, as if he needed the confirmation that what they had built was real and good and worth the work it had taken. "More than I ever dreamed possible," Grace answered, which was always true and never adequate to capture the fullness of what she felt. Ethan pulled her closer, his chin resting on top of her head. "I've been thinking," he said. "Hope's getting old enough to start learning the trade. How to read animal sign, how to tell good fur from bad, how to negotiate with the Shoshone. Daniel's already showing promise with the traps. Emma's too young yet, but she watches everything with those sharp eyes of hers. She'll learn fast when her time comes." "You're thinking about the future," Grace observed, "about what happens after we're gone." "After I'm gone," Ethan corrected gently. "You'll outlive me by decades, probably. Women usually do, but yes, I'm thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind. That's what all this has been about, hasn't it? Building something that lasts." Grace understood what he was not quite saying. Ethan was 46 years old, still strong, but beginning to feel the accumulated wear of nearly 30 years in the mountains. He was thinking about mortality, about making sure that when his time came, Grace and the children would be provided for, that the empire he had built would continue, that his life would have meant something beyond his own existence. "You've built something remarkable," she said. "Not just the trap lines and the trading post and this cabin. You've built a family. You've built a future. You've raised children who know how to work and how to love and how to be decent people in an indecent world. That's a legacy worth having." "We built it," Ethan corrected. "I had the land and the operation and the empty shell of a life. You made it mean something. You turned survival into living. That was you, Grace. That was always you." They stood there as the stars emerged one by one, as the mountain night settled around them with its familiar sounds and scents, as their children slept safe inside the home they had made together. This life they had built bore no resemblance to what either of them might have imagined in their youth. It was harder than Grace had dreamed and softer than Ethan had believed possible. It was real in ways that fairy tales never were, grounded in work and trust and the daily choice to show up and try again. Inside the cabin, baby Thomas stirred and whimpered, and Grace moved to go to him, but Ethan caught her hand. "Let me," he said. "You've been with them all day. I've got him." Grace watched through the window as Ethan picked up his youngest son with the same careful tenderness he had shown holding Hope that first time. He walked the floor, bouncing gently, talking to Thomas in that low voice that none of the children could resist. Within minutes, the baby had settled back to sleep, and Ethan stood there holding him, just holding him, as if memorizing this moment for some future time when such moments would no longer be possible. Grace felt her throat tighten with emotion. This hard man, This mountain man who had lived alone for 15 years, who had built an empire with his bare hands, who had chosen competence over beauty and honesty over romance. This man was now a father, holding his sleeping son with infinite gentleness, building a legacy not of money or property, but of love passed down through generations. She had been the sister, nobody wanted the woman, nobody saw the choice that surprised everyone. But she had become the wife of this remarkable man, the mother of his children, the keeper of a love built on truth instead of pretty lies. And that was better than any fairy tale because it was real and it was hers, and it would last as long as there were mountains to shelter it. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the first hard frost of autumn turning the meadow grass white. The family gathered for breakfast, the children chattering about their plans for the day, Ethan reviewing what needed to be done before the serious snows came. It was an ordinary morning in an extraordinary life, the kind of moment that would never make it into stories, but was the substance of what actually mattered. After breakfast, Ethan took Daniel and Hope out to check the nearby traps, teaching them the skills they would need to survive and thrive in this country. Grace watched them go, her son and daughter learning from their father the same way Ethan had learned from the mountain itself through careful observation and patient practice. Emma helped her mother with the day's baking, standing on a stool to reach the table, her small hands covered in flour, her face serious with concentration. Thomas slept in his cradle, dreaming whatever dreams babies dream. And Grace worked the same as she had every day for the past 7 years, the same as she would every day for years to come, building with her hands and her heart the life that made all the hard work worthwhile. They said the best loves do not announce themselves. They grow quiet in the spaces between words, in work done side by side, in hands that reach out in the dark. Ethan and Grace Blackwood proved something important in their years together in the high country. You do not need to shine to be seen. You do not need to be perfect to be chosen. You do not need declarations of undying passion to build a love that lasts. You just need to be real, to be honest, to show up every day and do the work, to choose your partner again and again in the small moments and the large ones, in sickness and health, in plenty, and want until choosing them becomes as natural as breathing. That was the legacy they built. Not just the trap lines or the trading post or the expanded cabin, not just the money in the bank or the relationships with the tribes or the land they owned. The real legacy was in the love they built twig by twig, day by day, honest and true and strong enough to withstand whatever the mountains threw at them. And when Ethan Blackwood finally laid his head down for the last time many years later, with his wife holding his hand and his children and grandchildren gathered around him, he died knowing that his life had meant something, that he had built something worth building, that he would be remembered not for his success, but for his love. That is what a man's life should be. Something built, something that lasts, something worth leaving behind. And in the end, that is more than enough.